In April 2003, the emergency services were called to a strange-looking fire on Wiganholt Common in West Sussex. Police found the burning body of missing 31-year-old special educational needs teacher and musician Jane Longhurst.
She's been found naked with a scarf covering her face and a pair of tights tied round her neck.
Jane had been strangled by her best friend's boyfriend, Graham Coutts.
I don't know what snapped. I don't know what was going on in his mind where he's made the leap from pure fantasy to living out his fantasy and taking somebody's life in the most horrific way.
As evidence piled up against Coots, he claimed to have killed Jane by accident in a sex game gone wrong, keeping her body in a storage unit for 5 weeks.
He was a necrophiliac. He found sexual pleasure in the thought of dead women.
As the police investigation against him gathered momentum, Graham Coutts proved himself to be one of the world's most evil killers. On Friday, the 14th of March 2003, Jane Longhurst left the home she shared with her boyfriend Malcolm in Brighton, East Sussex. She telephoned her best friend Lisa, but it was Lisa's boyfriend, Graham Coutts, who answered.
In fact, her friend was working that day. Coots answered the phone and suggested that they went swimming together. That was a very common thing between the young couples.
I can only believe that Jane never saw Graham Coutts, her friend Lisa's boyfriend, as anything of a threat. Why should she? They were friends. What Jane Longhurst didn't know was the psychiatric background of her friend Graham Coutts.
Jane never made it to the swimming pool. She went with Coots to the Hove flat he and his girlfriend shared, unaware of what he was planning to do. This killer's story begins in Scotland. Only child Graham Coutts was born on the 23rd of April 1968 in Leven, Fife.
Coots went to a local school, and then, in fact, the family moved south. He was not a particularly bright child. His passion, if there was one, was to become a guitarist. I think he saw himself as a sort of rock star.
From his early teens, Graham Coutts displayed worrying signs of a dysfunctional sexual appetite.
There's quite a strong history with Graham Coutts of problems with his sexual behaviours. We can see that it started very young. He knows what is turning him on, and he is using pornography at a very, very young age. The earlier in age that these things start to manifest, the more likely that it's going to become a much bigger problem further down the line.
It appears that Graham Coutts actually was addicted to extreme pornography. Death by asphyxia, all this stuff. And he, I think since the age of 15, had a real thing about those forms of sexual fantasy.
In 1991, at the age of 23, Graham Coutts confided in his GP that he was having elaborate sexual fantasies about killing women. Dr. Larry Culliford was the psychiatrist who saw Coutts in Hove, where he was then living.
I seem to remember being perhaps surprised that this was a person who didn't necessarily want to change. You know, he was having troubling thoughts, but was he really uncomfortable with them, or actually did he entertain them? That's a question I didn't know the answer to, and still don't. He investigated sexual pornography of the type that he was interested in, and there you're sort of feeding the impulses rather than seeking to reduce the strength of them.
Dr. Culliford concluded that Graham Coutts needed specialist help, but Coutts was never seen by anybody else.
I think if Graham Coutts had been seen by a forensic psychologist, he would have probably been invited to undertake a battery of psychological tests and some formal risk assessment, whether to consider him a risk to others. The mental health legislation is such that you can't lock everybody up who might commit crime. So the probability is that he would have been free to go at that point.
Instead of getting treatment, Graham Coutts took his fantasies to the next level, acting them out on a string of local women.
He was going about meeting women, trying to get them involved. He basically would get turned on by pressing his hand round women's necks. One of his ex-girlfriends said that he had pages and pages of pornographic material with a hand-drawn noose on the women's necks. So clearly there was something very wrong in his psyche. The warning signs were clearly there.
Graham Coutts' dark impulses had reached a turning point.
When you think about whether he might have taken a different journey through life, I think it's unlikely. He wasn't steering himself from that path. He was intensifying whatever it was that was going on in his head with his pornography use by actually indulging in those fantasies with his girlfriends. And for somebody who's doing that and actually enjoying distress, I don't see how that can't be a red flag.
In 1997, Coutts' sexual dysfunction escalated further when he was charged with spying on a woman in a swimming pool changing room in East Grinstead, Sussex.
We do have him being caught filming somebody in a swimming pool, so he's being covert, he's being predatory, he's being inappropriately sexual in a public place. Now, it's highly unlikely that was the first time that he'd done that.
The case went to magistrates, but Coutts was able to persuade the magistrates that he had done nothing wrong. The victim of this kind of unwanted attention was so concerned that she contacted the justices of the peace, but he was never brought to account for this.
This was the man who came into the life of special educational needs teacher and talented musician Jane Longhurst in 2001. Graham Coutts was living in Hove with his girlfriend Lisa when he met 31-year-old Jane and her boyfriend Malcolm.
Lisa and Jane were friends. The four of them, Lisa and Jane and Graham and Malcolm, would socialise, they would play tennis. Jane and Graham would go swimming together.
Jane Longhurst was an accomplished viola player and teacher living with her boyfriend of 4 years in Brighton, East Sussex.
Jane Longhurst was really everyone's ideal daughter. She was hardworking, she was talented, she was very close to her mum. She taught at a school in Cambridge before moving to Brighton. She was in every sense the best of the best.
Originally from Reading, Jane was close to her mother Liz and her sister Sue, who still lived there.
I think Liz was full of admiration for her daughter. She was deeply loved.
Jane Longhurst was a kind and thoughtful person who was well-liked, had lots of friends, and she was happy and content. She had a lovely life. She was planning to start a family. So, you know, she had everything to live for.
Graham Coutts, on the other hand, was not having the success he'd imagined for himself.
So Graham Coots was a bit of a loser, a drifter who'd gone through life wanting to be a professional musician, but failed at it. He had to work as a door-to-door salesman for a cleaning company. He just wanted to be in a band, but he wasn't up to it. He wasn't a great success in life.
Jane never saw Graham Coutts as anything of a threat. She had no reason to suspect him. She didn't know that he had a history of addiction to pornography, that he'd been fascinated since the age of 15 in strangling young women. How could she? And yet, he was the most dreadful threat to her.
On the morning of Friday, the 14th of March 2003, Jane left her flat on Shaftesbury Road in Brighton on her day off. Her boyfriend Malcolm was the first person to raise the alarm to Jane's mother Liz when she failed to return home.
He phoned her mother to see if she'd heard from Jane, phoned the orchestra that they both played with. No sign of her. It was most unusual. This wasn't something that Jane did. She was, very upright, very orderly young woman. This was absolutely out of character. Malcolm looked for her himself in Brighton, places they might have visited together. He didn't find her.
With still no sign of Jane into the early hours of the following day, worried boyfriend Malcolm reported her missing to Sussex police.
Like any police investigation, they're looking to find out what has happened to the missing person, and their lines of inquiry will immediately fall upon the people who are closest to Jane Longhurst, because, most murders are carried out by people who are known.
The boyfriend is interrogated at length. It's pretty intimidating. The girl you clearly are very fond of has gone missing, and you're suddenly in the frame for having done something to her. But no one, including Malcolm, who come up with any explanation about why Jane had gone missing.
There was nothing in her background which suggested that she wanted to vanish from her life that she clearly loved. So obviously the police were immediately suspicious that something was very amiss.
48 hours after Jane's last contact, her missing persons case was referred to the Criminal Investigation Department. Investigators analysed Jane's bank and phone records, looking for clues as to her whereabouts. No money had been withdrawn from her account over the weekend, and no phone calls had been made since the morning of her disappearance. This raised further concerns over Jane's safety. The last call from Jane's phone on Friday at 10:05 a.m. was to the home of her friend Lisa and Lisa's boyfriend, Graham Coutts. Graham told police Jane had called looking for Lisa. He denied having seen Jane that morning.
The police made extensive inquiries and they couldn't find anything. And they spoke to Coots and they spoke to his partner. Nothing. And there were no signs of what had happened to her. And it's a difficult job there for the police because they don't know whether this is simply somebody who maybe wandered off as a missing person or whether it's more serious than that because they didn't have a body or any scientific evidence that would show that she'd come to harm.
With still no sign of Jane 5 days after her disappearance, on Wednesday the 19th of March, Sussex police launched Operation Keen to find her.
They draft in extra officers, they go house to house, they start a careful search. It doesn't reveal anything. And after 2 weeks, they are forced to conclude that this may not be simply a missing person investigation, that it may actually be a murder investigation.
For 5 agonizing weeks, Jane remained missing. Then, on Saturday the 19th of April, a motorist made a horrifying discovery on Wiganholt Common in West Sussex, 20 miles from Jane's Brighton home.
A local man sees a fire in the brush, and it's got strange colour flames, and indeed calls the fire brigade. They discover that the source of this fire is a body. It is, sadly, the body of Jane Longhurst. She's been found naked with a scarf covering her face and a pair of tights tied round her neck. There is no doubt in anyone's mind Jane Longhurst has been murdered.
So far, police have no motive for this murder. They don't know whether or not Jane knew her killer. But they are determined to hunt down the person who carried out this brutal crime.
The police believe she was murdered some weeks before and her body preserved somewhere cold.
The police say however much the killer tried to hide Jane's body, it would have been difficult to disguise as he brought it here. They want people to cast their minds back to anything suspicious.
There's very few cases where an individual has done what he's done and then deposited the body and set fire to it without somebody close to that person knowing that something's not quite right.
The discovery of Jane's body was the worst possible end to her family's hellish wait.
Liz Longhurst is only just a widow, getting over the death of a much-loved husband from Alzheimer's. So, you know, it's absolute body blow for the family, really, to have this beloved daughter who she's so close to going missing in such appalling circumstances, and for so long before the body was found. That must have been just dreadful state of limbo.
No one can prepare you for something so terrible. To lose a loved one in such a way cannot ever be imagined, and we would not wish what we are going through on anyone.
We have lost someone who was very loved and so special. Please, if you think you know something, then find in your conscience to call the police.
With no suspects in what was now a murder investigation, the forensics team were tasked with uncovering what had happened.
Burning a body isn't very common, but when it does occur, it's usually in an attempt to try and disguise identity and to try and dispose of the body. Now, identification of burning remains can be tricky, but there are several things which we can use. In Jane Longhurst's case, the body was identified through dental records. That would be using the expertise of a forensic odontologist, comparing the teeth of the deceased with any dental records which were held in her name.
Having confirmed Jane's identity, the next question for forensic analysis was the cause of death.
When the body was discovered, there was a pair of tights around the neck. Now, as a pathologist, that would be very supportive of the use of a ligature strangulation. So using an item such as a rope or a belt, or in this case, a pair of tights, putting those around the neck and then pulling them tightly, the ligature that causes the blood to cease going to the brain.
With the forensic investigation underway, the police revisited the people closest to Jane to eliminate them from suspicion. On April 24th, a detective constable interviewing Coots at his home for a second time noticed a crucial detail that turned the investigation on its head.
They saw some boxes there, which were from the cleaning products company, and those were similar to the boxes that her body was found in.
It was an important discovery for investigators. Graham Coutts was suddenly the prime suspect in the brutal murder of Jane Longhurst. With no solid alibi for the night in question, Sussex police were confident they'd found their man. As the eyes of the nation watched on, the police investigators focused their efforts on their prime suspect, Graham Coutts. Detectives had grown suspicious of Coots when they found cardboard boxes that matched ones from the crime scene at his flat. And because he couldn't provide a solid alibi for the night in question. Coots was arrested on April the 24th, 2003, but in police custody, he refused to admit to any wrongdoing.
How would you describe your relationship with Jane? Friends? Anything more? No? When did you last see Jane Longhurst? It was Sunday before, when the girls came over. And the last time you spoke to Jane was the phone call on Friday.
Without a confession or more evidence to support their suspicions, the police could only hold Coots for 24 hours, and he was released the following day. Turning to the public for help, detectives ramped up their search for evidence that might link Coots to Jane's murder.
1 week after Jane's body was found, police are hoping these drivers will give them the vital clue they need. They're motorists who may have been using this road last week. They may have seen something which could lead police to Jane's killer. Early evening on a Saturday, at the same time as last week, when police believe Jane Longhurst's body was brought to this West Sussex beauty spot where it was dumped and set alight. It was a light evening on the bank holiday weekend. Police are convinced someone would have seen what happened here.
All these motorists will be stopped and questioned as to whether they were here last week, just to try and jog their memories to anything at all that is out of the ordinary, anything they may have noted that may give us just that significant lead.
On the 28th of April, Sussex police received the call they'd been waiting for. The manager of a local storage company reported a strange smell coming from a unit and a man calling himself Paul Kelly acting suspiciously.
So when the manager of the storage company saw reports in the media about Jane Longhurst being missing, he kind of put two and two together. Initially, he thought it was the smell of a dead pigeon or some other dead animal, but the fact that they have got a missing woman and there's a foul smell coming from a storage unit, I think he thought the information was significantly important and that the police should at least check it out.
When Sussex police came to check the CCTV footage, they saw Paul Kelly was in fact their main suspect, Graham Coutts.
It turns out to have been none other than Graham Coutts, using a false name. And he's had the storage facility for about 28 days.
Coots acquired the storage unit through a very simple process of using false information. Somebody turns up with a utility bill and other identification. They accept it at face value.
Gaining entry to Coots' storage unit, the police made a shocking discovery.
The police open the storage facility hired by Paul Kelly / Graham Coutts and discover Jane's clothing, a male shirt with blood and semen on it, and a condom.
They also found Jane's swimming costume, her cell phone, purse, and a gas can. Forensic analysis revealed Jane's DNA on both the bloodstained top and the used condom, which also contained Coots' semen. CCTV footage showed Coots had made multiple visits to the unit when Jane was missing. The evidence was overwhelming. Police finally had the proof they needed to arrest Coots for a second time.
The 35-year-old was arrested here just after 9 o'clock last night without a struggle. The police say he was one of the men they had already questioned when Jane disappeared.
And it dawns on the police that it's entirely possible that Coots has kept Jane's body in that storage facility for up to 5 weeks.
The day before Jane's body was discovered in the woods, CCTV footage showed Coots had moved a large cardboard box from his unit into a van.
He had just had a very large box with him. You couldn't tell what was in it. There was evidence at the storage unit to suggest that what was in the box had been a corpse.
On April the 30th, Graham Coutts was charged with murder at Brighton Magistrates Court and put on remand. With Coutts in custody, detectives seized his home computer and uncovered the disturbing truth about him.
Not only did he appear to be kind of porn addicted, he was obsessed with women's necks and he was obsessed with strangulation.
When the police were able to obtain the details of the websites that he was paying for access to, the contents of his computer filled the gap, as it were, as to why this happened in the way that it did. Because he was looking at all this necrophilia. Graham Coutts had found sexual pleasure in the thought of dead women, and he was paying to subscribe to websites which contained that sort of material. So his girlfriend didn't know that. Nobody knew that. And that only came to light once he was arrested, and of course his computer was seized, and then that material was found.
It was a shocking development in the case, but despite the mounting evidence against him, Coutts refused to admit to any crime. Then, several weeks after Coutts was arrested, there was a breakthrough.
To everyone's surprise, Coutts actually admits that he killed her. And says, and here is the most heinous part of it all, it was only a matter of consensual sex that had gone wrong.
Coutts claimed that Jane Longhurst had died at his flat on the 14th of March 2003, the date of her disappearance. He said they'd stopped by his home on their way to go swimming together.
They were driving to the leisure centre, and he said, I just need to pop into the flat. The only account that we have of what went on in the flat is his account, where he said they started kissing, they went to the bedroom, and they started having consensual sex without a word being said between them. And he said that just by a nod, she agreed to breath control play during the course of the sexual intercourse. And he used a ligature around her neck. Accidentally, she died in that process, was his account.
I don't believe for 1 minute that there was consensual sex that went wrong going on between Jane and Graham Coutts, not given his history, not given the way that he was escalating.
After Jane's death, Coutts had stored her body in his shed before moving it to the storage facility on the 25th of March, just days after his first interview with the police.
It was a storage facility where people typically will store their belongings if they're moving house or if they need to clear out a property. So he basically put a body in a box which had fragile written on it.
He kept a number of her belongings as a trophy, and he also kept a condom that contained material that would be consistent with him having had sex with her. But he put everything in there, including all her effects. He then visited her regularly there for about a period of 6 weeks.
But sickeningly, Coutts wasn't just visiting the storage facility to make sure Jane's body was still there.
The detectives had evidence to show that Graham Coutts had visited the body of Jane Longhurst in the yellow box storage unit 10 or 11 times.
Initially, he just had ordinary daytime access to it. And clearly he then changed to 24-hour access so that he could be there when there were no staff there.
He was recorded visiting these extreme pornography sites shortly after visiting the body. So it was quite clear that this man was acting out a perverse and deeply sickening sexual fantasy, not only in real time, but long after Jane had been so brutally murdered.
It is the most chilling thought of all. He's paid for out-of-hours access so that he doesn't have to always be seen when he's visiting Jane's remains. It's truly horrifying.
Eventually, after storing Jane's body for 5 weeks, Coots knew he had to try and hide the truth of what had happened to her.
And then, because of the state of the body, he went in late at night, and there was very good CCTV of him with a pallet truck taking a large box out, putting it in the back of his car, and he drove to West Sussex and set alight to her body there.
Graham Coutts' confession to strangling Jane and hiding her body was a pivotal moment in the investigation. But despite the evidence against him, Coutts was going to plead not guilty. The detectives had to prove that this was no accident. There was no sex game that had gone wrong. Prosecutors would need to show to a jury that there was a motive for murder.
It seemed to me to be a compelling case where he was the person who had not only murdered her, but kept her body for his own purposes thereafter and then disposed of it.
During the 11-day trial, the defense argued that Jane's death had been an accident, but the prosecution contradicted Coutts' version of events, with forensic evidence that they claimed proved otherwise. A key part of the evidence came down to understanding the nature of the act that had caused her death.
The defence would argue that the brief encounter of the pressure being applied to the neck has caused death rapidly. However, in reality, that's very unlikely. Death doesn't occur quickly. It occurs over several minutes with sustained pressure to the neck. And the victim would certainly be showing signs that they're struggling. Now, if it was a consensual act, you'd expect the person inflicting that act to then realise that, oh, this isn't right and I should stop. But obviously in this case that didn't occur.
Hearing my sister's reputation being slurred as a form of defence, socially unacceptable and very difficult to endure.
Journalist Helen Carter covered the trial.
He claimed that it was consensual sex that had gone wrong and that she was a willing participant in this sort of asphyxiation, which was a complete lie. It was pure gaslighting. They weren't involved in a relationship. She was planning her life with her boyfriend away from Sussex, and she was hoping to become a mother.
While the facts of his actions were presented in court, Coutts showed little emotion.
Coots pleaded not guilty throughout. He was a remarkably calm man, as I recall. I think always believed that he was going to be found not guilty.
Graham Coutts would like to convince the jury that he was a miscarriage of justice. He was at pains to deny any responsibility for her death. And it must have been so hard for Jane's partner, Malcolm, to sit there and listen to this person deny any responsibility for murdering his beloved partner, who he was planning the rest of his life with.
Coutts' defence that the strangulation was consensual and Jane's death was an accident was not believed by the jury. After 9 hours of deliberation at Lewes Crown Court, they unanimously found him guilty of murder. On the 4th of February 2004, Coutts was sentenced to 30 years, later reduced to 26 years on appeal, and was sent to HMP Wakefield. But the agony for Jane's loved ones was far from over.
In the months that followed, Coutts launched a number of appeals around a very specific legal ground. That the jury had not been offered the alternative explanation that Coots had indeed killed her accidentally during consensual sex. In other words, that it was manslaughter rather than murder.
2.5 years later, the House of Lords granted Coutts' appeal. His conviction was quashed on the 19th of October 2006 and a retrial ordered. He would remain in custody.
The friends and family of Jane Longhurst, they had the indignity of her being murdered in such horrific circumstances, then the denials, the false stories, the lies, the smears that he spread. But they have to go through one trial, the stress of that, and then for him to appeal it and there be a retrial. It's reliving that most traumatic, horrific part of their life.
In June 2007, a second trial began, this time with manslaughter as a possibility. Barrister Richard Barton once again acted for the prosecution.
Retrials are always more of a challenge. But I never had any doubt, and I'm sure that the police and the CPS never had any doubt of his guilt.
On Wednesday, the 4th of July 2007, after jurors had deliberated for 13 hours, Coots was once again found guilty of murder by a majority verdict and sentenced to life in prison.
Crown courts are dignified places where high drama is not permitted by judges, but following the verdict in the retrial, there were cheers from the public gallery, from the friends and family of Jane Longhurst, and I can hardly blame them.
Judge Richard Brown told him at the second trial, and I quote, "In seeking perverted sexual gratification by way of your sordid and evil fantasies, you've taken her life and devastated the lives of those she loved and those who loved her." And he concluded by saying, "You have shown not one jot of remorse."
As he was driven away, the prosecution described this murder as a despicable crime compounded by a despicable defense.
Despite Coots being behind bars for the rest of his life, for Jane's mother Liz and her sister Sue, the fight for justice wasn't over.
It's been a horrendous year for my family, with the murder of my sister, the violent murder of my sister Jane Longhurst, by the strangulation and rape. Graham Coutts, who has now got life imprisonment for this murder, was fueled by the internet, downloading images from websites. Do you pay by using your credit card?
Following the conviction of Graham Coutts, Liz campaigned to get the law changed because he was found to have pornography, which sparked his interest in the 1990s, and nothing was done about it.
Martin Salter, Labour MP for Reading at the time, worked on a campaign with Liz Longhurst.
She felt desperately sad, obviously, as to what happened to her daughter, and desperately sad that other young people could easily be put at risk. She wasn't ever seeking to outlaw all pornography. What she was concerned about was those extreme imagery that would tip, and I think it was her words, tip an unbalanced mind into acting out their fantasies. I think when we started, we couldn't get our heads around the fact that it was perfectly legal to broadcast images of young women being murdered and raped, some cases in real time, for those images to be available and able to be disseminated right away across the United Kingdom.
Even though the UK's Obscene Publications Act banned offensive material being published in Britain, it was no match for the millions of illicit images being posted on the internet from all over the world.
Much as they would have liked to, the Metropolitan Police Vice Squad or the law enforcement agencies in this country can't go after internet sites that are hosted in South America or somewhere else in the globe.
After 18 months of Liz Longhurst campaigning, the UK's obscenity laws were changed, making it illegal to possess pornography that features rape or torture.
Jane's mother, Elizabeth, was an extraordinary woman who was very dignified throughout, and the worst nightmare for any parent that she went through. But she campaigned tirelessly thereafter, along with others, and they achieved a change in the law. And I regularly prosecute people who have extreme pornography, similar to much that Coots at the time was looking at legally.
I think bringing about this change in the law meant everything to Liz. It's what she strove for. I was privileged to be part of that exercise, to help her on that journey. And whilst it meant everything, clearly didn't mean as much as having her daughter back.
The laws that Liz Longhurst's campaign helped change are still keeping people like Graham Coutts off the streets and protecting other families from the living nightmare that Jane's loved ones went through.
Graham Coutts will always present a danger to women. He's presented a danger to women since he was a teenager, and that really is by his own admission. He wasn't saying, I'm a potential rapist. He was saying, I'm a potential killer. He was saying that right from the beginning. He is never going to be safe to be around women.
He was a young man with a very dark side that he hid from everybody very well. What he did was evil.
He could have saved her had he stopped strangling her, but he didn't. He could have told the police where she was, but he didn't. He endeavoured to keep his perverted fantasy alive for as long as he possibly could before he dumped her naked body and set fire to it.
Graham Coutts was a man obsessed with satisfying his darkest sexual fantasies. Fueled by violent pornography, he strangled Jane Longhurst, a young woman in the prime of her life, and then kept her body in a storage unit for his own twisted gratification. His cold-blooded and depraved behavior sent shockwaves around the country. Coutts showed no remorse for his horrific actions, content to destroy the victim's reputation to escape justice. Graham Coutts will be remembered as one of Britain's most evil killers.